Things that are considered by white people today to be reasonable, or at least within the realm of general discussion, are things which only 20 years ago would have been seen as hateful and stupid. You may think this is a wonderful thing, or that it's horrible and signals the end of the United States as we know it, at the least, and perhaps more than that. But whatever your opinion, here we are. I'm not trying to reduce everything to a single factor, and I'm aware of the if you have a hammer, everything looks like a nail problem, but my interest was piqued a little bit when looking at testosterone. So 1, testosterone is declining. This is fairly simple and not something I expect a lot of resistance on. From the paper, Secular Trends in Testosterone, Findings from a Large State-Mandated Care Provider. Looked at data from blood serum samples from Maccabi Healthcare Services, which services 25% of the population of Israel. From this, we see a 22-year-old in 2017 had roughly the same testosterone levels as a 37-year-old in 2007. A 30-year-old in 2017 has the testosterone levels of a 68-year-old in 2007. Next, the paper Decline in Serum Testosterone Levels Among Adolescent and Young Adult Men in the USA looked at 4,045 males from 1999 to 2016 from the National Health and Nutritional Examination Survey, and among other things, looked at their serum testosterone levels upon measurement. What they found was that testosterone was, for all similar age groups, about 83.9% in the 2015 to 2016 sample, as it was in the 1919 to 2000 sample when age is controlled for. So it seems to be fairly well established that testosterone is going down. What effects might this have? So, characteristics of high versus low testosterone. Well, first is honesty. From the paper, Testosterone Administration Reduces Lying in Men. From February 2020, the researchers took 91 subjects from the University Hospital at the University of Bonn in Germany. They divided them into 2 groups, one which got a testosterone supplement, one which got a placebo. The groups were then to report the results from the roll of a single dice in a dice rolling computer program. Very simple. Whatever the number on the dice was, that's how much money they would be paid in euros, except for a 6, which would give them no euros. The dice rolls were pre-programmed to follow a normal distribution. Additionally, the experimenters didn't know what the dice rolls actually were for any given individual, so any social expectation effects would be removed if the participants in the study knew that the observers knew what the dice roll was going to be for them. Now, these were the results for the placebo group and the supplement group. Perfect honesty would be if each group reported payoff frequency that was at 16.666 repeating percent, or 1/6 of the time for each of these values. All the bars should be the same size if the subjects were perfectly honest. From this, we know that about 79% of the testosterone group told the truth, versus 53.34% for the placebo group. If we exclude those who actually rolled a 5, as they would have no incentive to lie, we get 77.91% telling the truth from the testosterone group and 45.84% for the placebo group. So the testosterone supplemented group told the truth 32.07% more often in absolute terms, or at 170% the rate of the placebo group. In terms of total value, the testosterone group was paid 1.33 times as many euros as the actual dice would have paid out if they were reporting honestly, and the placebo group was paid 1.67 times as much. 45 minutes prior to testing, the testosterone supplement group had a blood serum testosterone level of 7.78 nanograms per milliliter, while the placebo group had 6.7 nanograms per milliliter. So an increase in testosterone of 13.9% corresponded with a 70% increase in telling the truth on a dice rolling experiment, or a 50.75% reduction in the amount of money ripped off. The ultimatum game. One experiment that tests both fairness and risk is the ultimatum game. In this game, there are 2 individuals. One individual is given, let's say, $10. He then decides how much to give to another person. If the other person rejects the offer, neither person gets anything. Say Bob gets $10 to play the game with and has to make an offer to Jim. If Bob offers Jim $4, which would leave Bob with $6, Jim can choose to accept the offer or reject it. If Jim rejects the offer, neither party gets anything. The paper, Prejudice and Truth About the Effect of Testosterone on Human Bargaining Behavior looked at what offers people made in the ultimatum game based on whether they had a testosterone supplement or a placebo. They had 121 women, gave half of them testosterone supplements and half of them placebo. So this is looking at the effect of testosterone on women. They then paired them off into groups and ran the ultimatum game with random partners, each woman doing 3 different trials. What they found was that the group that received testosterone offered on average 39% of the money, while the placebo group offered 34%. What some might find interesting was that the women who believed they were given testosterone offered an average of 31%, while those who believed they were given a placebo offered 39%. So the effect of belief was stronger than the effect of testosterone itself in this study, or at least the effect of the testosterone supplement that they were given. This unfortunately entangles the effect of testosterone with the effect of belief. In this case, any independent effect of testosterone will be dampened by the independent effect of belief. So the actual independent strength of the testosterone itself is going to be reduced because it's entangled with the effects of belief. The authors broke down the results by belief and actually having received the testosterone supplement. And this gives a visually clear indicator, in my opinion, of the independent effect of testosterone. Public goods game. The paper, New Evidence on Testosterone and Cooperation, looked at the effects of a testosterone supplement on contribution to a public goods game. The public goods game is where an individual can choose to contribute to a public multiplier. The money is multiplied by a certain amount, but that multiplied money is then distributed among the players. For example, if there are 4 players and the multiplier is 1.2, if you contribute $20, that will multiply to 24. But all of that money will be divided among the players. The above illustration shows the problem, which is that so long as the multiplier is less than the number of players, the optimal selfish contribution is 0. The paper in question gave some participants a testosterone supplement or gave others a placebo. The results were that those who were given the testosterone supplement gave more in the public goods game than those who were given a placebo. They also looked at the effects of testosterone versus how wide your face is. This is the 2D/4D ratio, but basically just measuring how wide your face is. People with wider faces generally have higher testosterone on average throughout the day, given what's going on, and were exposed to more testosterone in the womb. Lower numbers means wider faces. People with thinner faces were actually more affected by testosterone supplementation than those with wider faces in this experiment. And of course, this makes sense, as women, quote-unquote, benefit more from anabolic steroids than men do. So if you're starting at a lower level of testosterone in your bloodstream, increasing it is going to have more effects. That is, you reach diminishing returns the higher you go. Also, as an aside, this is in fact a physiognomic indicator. Physiognomy being the prediction of behavior based on external physical traits, which makes sense as virtually the entire genome has some effect on the brain. And on top of that, the rest of the body affects the brain independently. For example, adipose tissues, fat, reduces testosterone. So a genetic predisposition to store more fat will result in lower testosterone, which will apparently causally influence behavior. This is a way in which the body causally affects the brain. So even if the genes which affected parts of the body didn't also have some effect on the brain directly at the genetic level, which they actually mostly do. That is, even if the genes that affected other parts of the body and genes that affected the brain were totally independent, that there was no overlap, their effects on the body will have some effect on the brain indirectly as well. Don't confuse indirect with not powerful or unimportant. Openness to minority positions. The paper, Basal Testosterone Renders Individuals More Receptive to Minority Positions, looked at how positively 250 individuals reacted to one of 2 messages. The first was a message stating why there should be a tunnel built under Rotterdam Harbor, and the second was promoting a fictional resort labeled Curaçao Lake. For the Rotterdam tunnel, the subjects were either told that 85% of Rotterdam residents supported the tunnel, high consensus, or that 15% supported the tunnel, low consensus. For the Curacao Lake Resort, they were told that either 86 or 14% of tourists agreed that Curacao Lake was a rewarding place to visit. After reading the messages and writing what they thought about, their testosterone levels were measured through their saliva. And here were the results. Thought valence is how positively or negatively the person rated the proposition. This was done by tallying up the number of positive and negative thoughts the person wrote down in response to the message. Obviously, this weights each thought the same, but you have to operationalize this somehow, and over the whole sample, this effect should be expected to wash out. And attitude, that's just how positively or negatively the person rated the statement about the Rotterdam Tunnel or how nice Curacao Lake was on, I think, a 1 to 10 scale or something. And of course, the results were that people with high testosterone were more likely to support the low consensus argument, not only in comparison to people with lower testosterone, but actually supported the statement more when it had low consensus than when the same statement had high consensus. At the right end of these charts are the individuals with the highest testosterone. And at the far right tail, you see low consensus crossing over the high consensus line, which means that at a certain level of testosterone, the fact that a position lacks consensus makes them more likely to agree with. Also interesting is that the lines cross sooner in the thought valence than with the attitude chart. And I have some speculation as to why that may be, which is that people with higher testosterone are searching for a way to agree with the low consensus position. That the consensus acts as a kind of psychological barrier to supporting something. And if you have higher testosterone, you have an inclination to seek the minority position, to seek the heterodox position. And so the fact that people with somewhat high testosterone, but not at the highest levels, they're more likely to give better thoughts. They're more likely to write more positive thoughts about the minority position. They're not as likely to then bite the bullet and say, I support the minority position. So it seems like they're trying to, basically they're mentally seeking, they're trying to support the minority position to get enough thoughts in their head to convince themselves enough to overcome the psychological barrier of a perceived consensus. And that's why I think the lines cross sooner in the thought valence category than in the attitudes category. However, that is just my personal speculation. That's not evidence in this experiment that I am describing. Okay, racism, quote unquote. There's evidence that people with higher testosterone express more quote unquote racist attitudes. Now, to clarification. First, racist attitude in practice means a negative generalization by a white person about any non-white group. Very rarely is it used in any other way, in any other direction. It's always about whites having insufficiently positive views about some other race. So, for example, if you have an insufficiently positive view of black people, that is defined as a racist attitude. Second, expresses is key. Higher testosterone in whites is not associated with more negative attitudes towards blacks according to implicit association tests. It is associated with more openly, explicitly expressed statements. Now, if you don't know what the implicit association test is, you can take a sample test. And it doesn't take very long on the internet. That will be linked in the description or inline linked in the article. The implicit association test is where on a computer you have to press a key for, say, black or white with various words and objects. So you would start by training muscle memory to press E on the keyboard for black and I on the keyboard for white. The next phase involves pressing those same keys for good or bad words. For example, the word failure, nasty, and selfish would be bad, and triumph, joyful, and kind would be good. Then you have two more phases where you would associate good words with blacks and bad words with whites, and then the opposite, good words with whites and bad words with blacks. And what they do is then they compare the speed and the error rate when trying to associate good words with whites or good words with blacks, and that's used to give your implicit bias score. Now, since it is very likely that the listener, if he knows what the implicit association test is, has skepticism towards the implicit association test. So first, let's deal with some of that likely skepticism. The paper, Understanding and Using the Implicit Association Test, Meta-Analysis of Predictive Validity, was focused on the predictive validity of implicit association tests. They looked at 184 studies that compared various measures of implicit attitudes. These were then compared to some sort of objective criterion, right? So they take 1, a person's implicit association test score, 2, how explicitly biased they claim to be openly, and then compare these scores to some sort of objective measure. Examples of objective criterions would be how much to punish a black criminal or how much welfare should be given to some racial group. This is meant to test how much the implicit association test predicts policy support, and compare that to how well just asking people how biased they are predicts policy support. Okay, so all that said, Table 3 gives the punchline on this. So the point of this is that, yes, implicit association test is a valid predictor for racial bias, or what is labeled as racial bias in policy prescription. In every category except race, black, white, and other intergroup behavior, explicit attitudes predict better than implicit ones. But for race in particular, implicit attitudes predict better than implicit ones. Speculation. This is due to the suppression of expressing real beliefs regarding race, particularly about blacks in the United States, which is higher than anything else, right? That is, it's safer to be anti-gay than it is to be insufficiently pro-black, right? And also, as an aside, you should note the very low IAT explicit correlations. This is something that is rather important and will tie into other things that I'm going to be doing videos on as part of this book later. Okay, now we've established the implicit association test as something that is valid. Next, facial width correlates with testosterone levels. The paper, Telling Facial Metrics. Facial width is associated with testosterone levels in men, looked at 195 men and how the width of their face correlated with their testosterone levels. They found that they correlated at 0.18, a fairly weak correlation, but one nonetheless. It's also important to keep in mind that testosterone fluctuates throughout the day, and it also fluctuates day to day. This fluctuation arguably makes facial width a better indicator of how testosteronized a person is than their measured testosterone at any one point in time. Because facial width is an indicator of how much testosterone has influenced the development of their bone structure in particular, and whatever other effects that would have. It's an indicator of testosterone on a person's development. Okay, all that said, finally the punchline. From the paper, facial structure is indicative of explicit support for prejudicial beliefs. Question the idea that these are, in fact, prejudicial beliefs. They could very well just be accurate post-judicial beliefs, but they find that white males with wider faces are more likely to openly say what are called prejudiced things. But their IAT scores aren't actually any higher than people with lower testosterone, so that they're higher on the explicit statements, but no different on the implicit beliefs as captured by the implicit association tests. The correlation between facial width and explicitly endorsed racisms was 0.211. Just a reminder for what this means in practice. This means that a 10% increase in the percentile rank of your facial width, you will get a 2.11% increase in your racism rank. So, just for example, take a look at this picture. This is what they used in the, one of the pictures they used in the paper. And this is, of course, an extreme comparison, but which one of these guys do you think is more likely to say not nice things about black people? This may sort of bug you because it's basically saying physiognomy is real, but, well, physiognomy is real. Why wouldn't it be? Another study conducted and talked about in the paper above was of external observers looking at the faces of guys who were asked, and they were then asked how racist these people were. And the external observers, without knowing the results, were asked to guess how racist the guy was by just looking at his face. And so here were their guesses. The evaluation of how prejudiced a person was based on what their face looks like, and then, that correlates with what their face looks like. Now, a 0.211 correlation may seem small, and around the average of population distributions, this probably won't be very useful as a predictor. But if you compared someone at, say, the 10th percentile of face wideness to someone at the 90th percentile, they would be visibly different, and the post-judicial predictions you would have about those guys would begin to kick in. That is, your own brain would look at these two guys, and even though you weren't consciously trying to make these associations, your brain is, right? And so you would then say, oh, this guy looks like someone who might be insufficiently positive about Jews or something. This is not something you had to be taught by anyone. It's just your brain finding patterns and making sense of the world, and this is now being vindicated through experimentation. But remember, there was no relation between face wideness and IAT score, meaning that wide-faced people openly expressed more quote-unquote racist views, but didn't have any more implicit bias according to the IAT. And my speculation from all this is that people with higher testosterone are just more likely to say what they believe. That is, they are less socially sensitive. They are less sensitive to the possibility of ostracism or things like that. And they are more honest. And so both of those things are going to give this effect. In more real-world terms, the standard deviations for the male populations in the U.S. for testosterone is about 184.29 nanograms per milliliter. Standard deviation is this thing. So a 1 standard deviation shift in testosterone would, based on this single study, increase or decrease racial prejudice, as they call it, by 21.1 percentile points. How much has testosterone declined? Well, about 169 nanograms per milliliter based on the study mentioned earlier, meaning the distribution appears to have shifted about 0.917 standard deviations downward. So based on this, we would predict that the amount of open racial prejudice among whites would decline for the average person about 19.5 percentile points, meaning the average would be 19.5 percentile points from 1990 to 2016 based on the norms of 1990. Now, for the average person, this effect may not be too pronounced. The average Joe probably makes fewer nagger jokes than 20 years ago, but otherwise not really a whole lot different in this regard for most people you're interacting with. But you're shifting the entire distribution downward. A quick and dirty addendum for what this will mean in practice. Here's a normal distribution. It can be for anything, but here we're talking about testosterone. And let's shade in red anything below 1.5 standard deviations. This will be 6.7% of the population. And this curve here, this will be the testosterone levels in 1990, let's say. So this is, the shaded in red is 6.7%, the lowest testosterone levels in 1990. But since then, it's shifted about 0.9 of a standard deviation to the left. Now, it's a bit messy, but let's see how much of the new downshifted curve here, how much those lower testosterone levels they'll make up of this new curve, right? And so you can see here visually how much more of that space gets filled by what was in 1990 only 6.7% of the population. Now let's separate the curves out here to get a bit of a cleaner comparison, basically the bottom 6.7% is now around 25%. I forgot how to calculate this, how much of an area of a certain threshold based on a shift in standard distribution. Obviously, there's a way to do it. I personally don't remember how to do it. I can't be arsed to do it here. So, but it looks, just eyeballing it, it looks in this new curve to be around 25%. It looks like, yeah. And these effects are going to get more pronounced the further to the tails you go. So going back to that overlap image around here, you can see these people with testosterone levels that virtually didn't even exist in 1990. And of course, the same would be true on the right end of the tail, except in the reverse. There were people with testosterone levels so high that those people basically don't even exist anymore. Okay, and so the effects of a lowered testosterone level of 0.9 something standard deviation, even if the correlation between that and, quote unquote racial prejudice is only 0.211, you may be thinking, well, around sort of the average Joe, people don't seem to be that different from what they used to be. They don't seem to be too terribly different, but there seems to be a lot more just loonies about this. There seem to be a lot of people who are really, really big system believers, really big narrative believers, and really big the authoritarian view of knowledge, really big authority believers, big fans of censorship, really groupthinky, doesn't like minority opinions very much, right? That there's a lot more of those kinds of people. And this is sort of what you would expect given the tail effects, given just the explosion of the people who are like that. Even if the average is only going down, 19.5 percentile points along this curve, that's going to result in a many times increase in the worst kinds of people. Bullying. The paper Androgen Dynamics in the Context of Children's Peer Relation looked at 80 boys and 71 girls in Canada aged on average 12 years and 7 months. They were asked in a fairly detailed way if they thought they had been bullied. And the paper describes a questionnaire and an interview, and it was very clear the authors wanted a firm definition of bullying and asked questions in a way so as to filter out either liars or kids who had a very loose definition. So this was a study that, at least at the way they describe their methods, was fairly extensively done, more well done than most studies. The researchers themselves assigned a value to the kids as being never bullied, occasionally bullied, or frequently bullied. They then took testosterone samples from saliva from all the kids throughout the day, and here were the results. So for boys, testosterone was highest among those determined to have been frequently bullied. For girls, it was highest among those determined to be never bullied, followed by frequently bullied, with occasionally bullied being the lowest. The paper, Male Testosterone Linked to High Social Dominance but Low Physical Aggression in Early Adolescence, looked at 178 boys from age 6 to 13 in Montreal schools. And they did this longitudinally. This was a long, ongoing project on this. Another very intensive, a lot of effort into this study. They compared peer-rated measures of popularity, measures of physical aggression, and then they measured the kids' testosterone levels at multiple times during the day. The obvious problem, of course, is aggression, as getting in a lot of fights or, lashing out against bullies can be confused for aggression. Teachers were asked to evaluate which boys got in a lot of fights but also which would try to instigate fights or try to intimidate the other boys. Unfortunately, the authors don't differentiate these three. So a kid who gets picked on a lot, and so as a result gets in a lot of fights, as a result gets lumped into the aggression score. If the idea that an academic would do something this silly seems unbelievable to you, I would recommend reading my first book. They do things that are this silly and this obviously silly, and they are as silly as they seem on a superficial level, right? When you look deeper, your superficial prejudices are confirmed that yes, they are making a very silly decision here. Okay. If the viewer thinks that a researcher, a professional person, wouldn't make an error this simplistic, it happens all the time. Now, the results, though, were that the boys who didn't fight a lot, they had the highest testosterone. And the boys who fought the most had the lowest testosterone. The highest testosterone was among those who are classed as highly anxious and being a low fighter. So kids who were fairly anxious but didn't fight had the highest testosterone levels. When viewed in the light of the previous study, where boys who were determined to be bullied the most had the highest testosterone levels, which in that study was not just focused on physical aggression, this seems to be the kind of person who got bullied. And while the second study conflated, intimidation and real aggression with just fighting overall in their overall aggression measure, it seems, in light of the previous study, it seems to imply that people who engage in bullying have lower testosterone, right? So isolated the error of sort of conflating aggression and, in my opinion, not properly differentiating real bullying from, a picked on kid lashing out. That seems like that could be a really big problem, but they still, it's separated out a little bit, even though both measures, like instigating fights versus just being in fights, that they are sort of lumped into a single measure, but you still have the instigating fights measure in there, right? And these results, in tandem with the previous study's results, together they point to bullying being a sort of lower testosterone thing. Especially if you think of bullying as being something that's done more in groups, this makes more sense in light of lower testosterone having less tolerance for minority positions. Okay, what would be possible outcomes of lower testosterone in a population? Now, I'm going to wax poetic and be a little bit more speculative here. Basically, in everything I write and do, I have the data and then I have the punchline. But I want to keep the punchline separate from the data because there's a chance the viewer will disagree with the punchline. And that will then cause them to question the data or think I'm cherry picking or misleading. And I will tell you, I am not intentionally cherry picking or misleading. If I am, in fact, misleading, I am also misleading myself. Okay, it is not, I am not being dishonest about this, though I may be wrong and have been before. So this is just a notification of the split from data to punchline, and you can agree with one but not the other. It is possible, right? You could say somebody is accurately describing something, but then in terms of his interpretation for what that means, that's influenced by all sorts of prior beliefs that I don't agree with, right? You can in fact separate the two, right? And in fact, I do this with research papers all the time, right? You can cite an academic's data, but you don't have to agree with their punchline, okay? So let's just keep those things separate. So at the start of this, we mentioned that there has been a steep decline in testosterone levels in the U.S. population. We didn't go into a lot of studies on that, given that this is something which there doesn't seem to be a whole lot of resistance to. I don't really have to persuade you that testosterone levels are going down. It's something rather simple, easy to measure, replicated all the time. So, I didn't spend a whole lot of time on that because there's no resistance on that. What would be the possible results of a general decline in testosterone across the entire population? Well, looking at these studies here, they appear to be less honesty, less contribution to the public good, more cutthroat negotiations, less generous deals in the ultimatum game, for example, more bullying in kids. It may be a little bit arguable, but the two studies combined seem to heavily imply that there will be more bullying in kids, and whatever the behavioral analog of that would be in adults. How do adults bully? Would we expect to see more of that based on this experimental data from kids? Right? Do we see adults engaging in quote-unquote adult bullying behavior more? Is cancel culture that? You expect more groupthink, less interest in minority positions. Now, to people who haven't had a heterodox thought in their life, you may not be aware of just how hostile the world is becoming to minority positions. You know, like, for example, if you think that fact checkers are a good thing, right, you may not be aware of how more groupthinky things are becoming. But yeah, you would expect that. But, I'm going off on a little tangent here. You would expect more groupthink as a result of lower T, and you would also expect there to be less openly expressed bad beliefs, whatever those happen to be at your given place and time. Now, today, that means a bad belief is saying like, oh, I don't think black people are oppressed. I think the inequalities are down to genetic differences. That would be a bad thing to say. In fact, it is against YouTube's terms of service to openly say that, right, as if you believe that in a video on YouTube. So that would be a bad belief. Middle Ages, a bad belief would be like denying the divinity of Christ or something, right? So different places and times, but if you have lower testosterone, you would expect there to be fewer openly expressed, defiant statements and stuff. But the thing is, this lower openly expressed bad beliefs, quote unquote, this can sort of be seen as a result of just less honesty in general. Now, some of these traits here, they feel like they may go together. For example, bullying and groupthink certainly feel like they go together. But certainly the United States, across all institutions, has clearly become more censorious. And the average person is at a very visceral level far more authoritarian in his thinking than he was just 10 years ago, referencing institutional positions and source facts and organizational statements and stuff, with the rise of like fact checking, where specific organizations get to decide what the facts are, right? A far less open, far less exploratory sort of thing. And you may say this is good because it prevents ideas that like the moon landing was a hoax. It prevents that from gaining traction. But, the cost benefit on that, a lot of the things that it prevents aren't very important, or a lot of the things that it prevents either aren't very important or they're super important, right? So making it so kids believe in like evolution is not very important, or making people believe that the moon landing was real is not very important. Whereas the idea that different population groups that evolved on different continents and have met quantifiable differences in every part of the body, including brain size and shape and overall morphology, but no difference in any but that doesn't manifest in any difference in behavior, right? That is a very profound belief and has profound implications on things like immigration and what you think are the causes of inequality. And so that is a very important thing on which discussion is being shut down. So the upside is kind of trivial, right? Like getting people to stop believing in the moon landing or UFOs or whatever, that's not very important. Whereas the topic of race differences is extremely important and has life or death consequences on your civilization depending on what the truth is, and the truth itself is going to matter whatever you think about it, right? You can't just wish happy thoughts on that, on this issue, or what you consider happy thoughts on that issue and have the effects go away. But anyways, certainly testosterone has gone down, and certainly we should expect there to be some change in the way people act and what they believe as a result of that. And the changes are viscerally apparent in the world, appear to be in line with what these studies say are the result of low testosterone. But, on top of it, we should also think of what the knock-on effects of this might be. As testosterone declines, people become more groupthinky and more hostile to deviance, whatever the deviant is at their place and time in history. Today, deviant really only means not having a sufficiently positive view of one of the privileged demographics. Blacks and Jews primarily, and to a lesser extent other brown people, and of course the sort of fabricated privileged groups like transsexuals, homosexuals, right? Things that are kind of a result of choice then make them a privileged group, which then you then have to be positive about them. So you're kind of burning the candle at both ends, right? Because people are, first of all, far more sensitive to consensus and to perceived authority as a result of low T, right? If assuming this, what I'm saying here is true, like assuming my interpretation of the data is generally true, people are far more sensitive to consensus and far more sensitive to perceived authority. They're less likely to be sort of thinking for themselves with all the terrible and great dangers that might entail. So you have people who are already going to be less resistant to shunning and social pressure. And those people are probably going to engage in more shunning themselves. And they're going to shun harder, right? So on the one hand, you have an increase in shunning. You're going to have an increase in shunning behavior, and you're going to have a population that is less resistant to it. So it doubles, right? And then, of course, this also moves the needle over time, creating a new kind of mental status quo with all the psychological inertia bias that has. Right. That is, it is now established that, say, we ban people who don't trust a government's claims that their government-run elections were on the up and up. Right. That is now established as a thing that is the new status quo. And so even if the effect of lower testosterone only explains so much on an individual basis, it can kind of result in more of a cascading failure. You can have the greater effect that is authority and perceived consensus become more effective on people, and authority and consensus are used more heavily as bludgeons on people, right? So they're weaker to it and the hammer is stronger. And that then causes, people to sort of be bullied into accepting things. If you control the institutions, they become more pliable to narratives. And then that then allows you to move the narrative on something, one point a lot easier. And then once you've moved it one point, it then develops psychological inertia. That becomes the normal way things are done. Then you move it a point again, point again, a point again, a point again. If you can walk a mile, you can walk 5 miles. If you can walk 5 miles, you can walk 10 miles. If you walk 10 miles, you can walk 100 miles, right? All that said, let's back up and avoid reducing everything to testosterone. It appears to be a factor. It appears to sort of explain things in the direction of the way society is going. But things like the demographics of the elites, quote unquote, can be another. Elites being like people who are in managerial positions in big companies, universities, government, social media sites, like the functional elites. What their demographic makeup is, that can be another, right? So I'm not saying that this testosterone thing is the end all be all. You should always be on guard for, if you have a hammer, everything looks like a nail. If you know about testosterone, everything then gets explained in the context of testosterone. So always be careful about that. Be on guard for that. But also, like, if this narrative becomes kind of popular and people say this more and more, just sort of prepare your mind for debunking, right? It's going to be quote unquote debunked. Fact checkers are going to debunk it. So just understand that's how this works. That always happens. So just understand that just because some site or fact checker or some guy's blog or whatever says this is wrong doesn't mean there isn't another rebuttal to the rebuttal, right? Or that there isn't, that like, oh, this was then shown to be wrong. That's it. That's the end of the story, right? It goes in rounds. Okay, things go in rounds. There's levels to arguments, right? But yeah, that's it. That's what I think about the effects of testosterone. I'm not quite clear on the overall magnitude of testosterone in isolation. It appears to be working with a lot of other things that's going on, which is then leading to the cascading failures that we see playing out.